She was born not in Russia, but in a small Prussian principality, under a name few Russians could pronounce, Sophie Friederich August von Anhalt-Zerbst, another minor German princess among dozens, with little more than a fragile claim to nobility and the refined manners expected of court girls. No one at the time could have guessed that this obscure young girl would one day rule the largest empire on earth, not merely as a figurehead, but as its most formidable monarch. From the very start, young Sophie showed an ambition far greater than her title suggested. While other noble girls were trained to smile, curtsy, and marry well, Sophie read voraciously. Philosophy, history, the workings of statecraft, nothing was off limits. She absorbed Enlightenment thought while still learning to hold her posture at royal banquets. Her mind was already reaching far beyond the parlors and corridors of her provincial palace, when she received an invitation to the Russian court engineered by Empress Elizabeth herself. Sophie was barely 14. The Empress needed a suitable bride for her nephew and heir, the awkward, emotionally volatile Peter, and Sophie, Protestant and pliable, seemed ideal. But what the Empress didn't anticipate was that Sophie would not remain pliable for long. Upon arriving in Russia, Sophie shed her German roots with startling ease. She converted to Orthodox Christianity, changed her name to Ekaterina Alexeyevna Catherine, and never looked back. She threw herself into learning the Russian language, Russian customs, Russian politics. Her transformation wasn't just cosmetic, it was strategic. She understood something few outsiders did. In Russia, survival demanded more than obedience. It demanded metamorphosis. Catherine wasn't just playing a role, she was rewriting her identity. And she wasn't doing it for love. Her, the future Peter III, was a man she barely tolerated and would later come to despise. But for now, she smiled. She curtsied. She studied the court like a battlefield, taking mental notes on allies and enemies, calculating every move with the quiet patience of someone preparing for something much bigger. Because even as a teenager, Catherine didn't just dream of being empress, she planned for it. Catherine's marriage to Peter was less a union of hearts and more a collision of political necessity and personal indifference. From the moment they were wed, it was clear this was not a partnership built to last. Peter, immature and erratic, had little interest in governance or in Catherine. He idolized Frederick the Great, despised Russian culture, and preferred playing with toy soldiers to attending state matters, and he made no effort to hide his contempt for his new wife. Catherine, on the other hand, played her role with grace, masking her growing resentment with charm and intellect. She studied politics in private while enduring public humiliation. Her husband paraded his lovers through the palace. Catherine endured in silence, all the while cultivating her own circle of allies quietly, deliberately, and without ever raising suspicion. She understood that in this game, timing was everything. The moment to strike would come. She just had to be ready. Behind the grand chandeliers and gold-trimmed halls of the Winter Palace, Catherine was becoming fluent in the language of power. She corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot, not merely as a curious reader, but as a political thinker in her own right. Her intellect impressed foreign ambassadors, courtiers, even her enemies. Russia, still under the rule of others, was already starting to bend quietly toward her will. Then, in 1762, everything changed. Empress Elizabeth died. Peter ascended the throne as Emperor Peter III and promptly began alienating nearly every powerful faction in Russia. He withdrew from the 7 Years' War, made peace with Prussia, and implemented reforms that infuriated the military and nobility alike. In mere months, Peter managed to isolate himself from the church, the army, and the very court that had once supported his claim. Catherine saw the collapse coming, and when it arrived, she didn't hesitate. With the support of the military, especially the powerful Orlov brothers, Catherine staged a coup. It was swift, bloodless, and shockingly effective. Peter was forced to abdicate. Days later, he was dead under mysterious circumstances. And just like that, Catherine, German-born, foreign-named, unloved and underestimated, was now Empress of all Russia. But her reign was only beginning. Catherine didn't just seize the throne, she seized the narrative. In a world dominated by male rulers and dynastic suspicion, she had to prove not only that she could wear the crown, but that she could wield it. And she did so with a clarity of vision and ferocity of will rarely seen in the imperial courts of Europe. From the moment of her coronation, Catherine made it her mission to reshape Russian, only in structure, but in spirit. She wanted to modernize the empire, to pull it into the Enlightenment while preserving the sheer force and identity of its vast, diverse dominion. To do that, she needed more than advisors and decrees. She needed an image and idea of herself that would command respect across every corner of her empire and beyond. She cultivated this image with ruthless precision. She became the mother of the nation, patron of the arts, defender of the Orthodox Church, and tireless reformer. She wrote essays, she reformed education, she championed vaccination, promoted science, and corresponded with Europe's greatest thinkers. She read Montesquieu, implemented Enlightenment principles into her legal codes, and founded schools for both boys and girls, a radical move at the time. And yet, she was never naive. While she spoke the language of reason and progress, she never let go of autocracy. Catherine understood that a strong Russia required a strong ruler. She listened to ideas but ruled alone. Her reforms were sweeping, but always grounded in realism. When the French Revolution erupted and heads began to roll in Paris, Catherine cooled her sympathy for revolutionary thought. She saw what happened when power fell into the hands of the mob, and she had no intention of sharing hers. Still, she didn't isolate herself behind palace walls. She traveled throughout the empire, sometimes in secret, disguised in simpler clothes to observe the real lives of her people. She wanted to understand what made Russia tick, not just its capital, but its farthest, frostbitten edges. Her reign was marked by expansion, exploration, and consolidation. Under her rule, Russia grew into a European superpower, but with power came enemies. And with enemies, endless rumors. Power, especially in the hands of a woman, has always drawn whispers, and Catherine's reign was no exception. While she ruled with brilliance and iron will, the court and much of Europe chose instead to fixate on her private life. Rumors swirled like courtly perfume, thick with scandal and intrigue. Yes, Catherine had lovers, many of them, but unlike her political counterparts who hid their indiscretions, she was unapologetic. She did not seek a romanticized fairy tale. She sought companionship, loyalty, and at times, strategic alliances. Her favorites, often younger and fiercely loyal, were rewarded with titles, lands, and influence. Some even acted as trusted political advisors behind closed doors. To her enemies, these relationships were proof of moral decay. To Catherine, they were part of survival. In a world where men dominated every space, intimacy could be weaponized or reclaimed. She used it to disarm, to distract, and sometimes, to outmaneuver rivals who underestimated her. The Empress was no fool. She knew perception was power, and if the world wanted to talk, she made sure they were always talking about her. But behind the rumors was a woman carrying the enormous weight of empire. Catherine wrote constantly about governance, philosophy, human nature. Her journals reveal not a hedonist, but a strategist, not a seductress, but a thinker. She agonized over peasant revolts, navigated the chaos of imperial succession, and carefully shaped Russia's stance in a shifting European landscape. And then came Pugachev's rebellion. A former soldier, claiming to be her dead husband Peter III, rallied thousands of disgruntled peasants and Cossacks, unleashing one of the most terrifying uprisings in Russian history. For Catherine, it was a brutal wake-up call. Enlightenment ideals were noble in theory, but when faced with armed mobs and burning villages, even the most philosophical empress had to defend her throne with steel. She crushed the rebellion, tightened her grip on the nobility, and redoubled her efforts to centralize power. The dream of liberal reform was wounded, but not dead. Catherine had learned, reform must move at the pace of control, because for all her vision, she was still an autocrat. And autocrats do not survive on ideas alone, they survive by mastering reality. As Catherine aged, the world began to shift around her. New philosophies emerged, new threats loomed, revolutions rattled old thrones. Yet Catherine remained a singular force of vision, intellect, and raw determination. She continued to govern with relentless energy, issuing decrees, overseeing foreign policy, and expanding Russia's reach into Crimea, the Black Sea, and parts of Poland. She had come to power by outmaneuvering men. Now, she outlasted them, but time has no court to command, and even as her empire grew, so did the shadows of succession. Her son Paul, whom she never trusted and often sidelined, waited impatiently in the wings. Their relationship was cold, formal, fractured by years of political distance and personal disappointment. Catherine had even considered bypassing him entirely in favor of her grandson, Alexander, whose temperament seemed more in line with her own ideals. She worked tirelessly until the very end. Even in her final years, Catherine remained sharp, articulate, and endlessly engaged. She revised legal codes, restructured institutions, commissioned art, and expanded education. Her court became one of the most cultured in Europe, a dazzling blend of power and sophistication, where French was spoken more often than Russian, and ideas flowed as freely as wine. Yet the rumors never left her. Historians, poets, and propagandists alike fixated on the salacious, ignoring the revolutionary. They told stories of lust but forgot her libraries. They painted her as a seductress, but not as a sovereign who corresponded with Voltaire, governed a sixth of the earth, and left Russia stronger, wealthier, and more respected than ever before. When Catherine died in 1796, she left behind more than an empire. She left behind a paradox. A woman who ruled like a man, yet never stopped being a woman. An autocrat who read Enlightenment philosophy. A foreigner who became more Russian than most Tsars. A monarch who loved power but not for its own sake. She loved it for what it could create. Within the high gilded walls of St. Petersburg, Catherine wasn't simply ruling, she was curating an empire of ideas. Her court became a beacon of culture, science, and art. What Versailles had been to France, she wanted the Winter Palace to be for Russia, a crucible of civilization, a gallery of greatness. She invited thinkers, artists, architects, and composers from all over Europe. She commissioned grand halls, vast libraries, dramatic sculptures, and neoclassical masterpieces that lined corridors like silent witnesses to her vision. Russia, once considered a barbaric land by Western Europeans, was becoming under her hand a place of elegance, sophistication, and intellectual vigor. But Catherine's brilliance wasn't just in what she built, it was in how she used it. Her patronage wasn't charity, it was policy. Every painting hung, every opera sponsored, every philosophical exchange was calculated. They were messages, to her people, to the nobility, and to Europe itself. Messages that said, Russia is not behind, Russia leads. She wrote plays under pseudonyms, issued literary critiques, and corresponded with Enlightenment figures as an equal. Voltaire called her the Star of the North. Diderot praised her mind as imperial in its own right. And while her reforms didn't always reach the deepest roots of serfdom or absolutism, she was not afraid to question those foundations even as she stood upon them. The contradiction was sharp, but she lived within it. She could promote education while keeping the peasantry in chains. She could celebrate freedom of thought while silencing dissent. And through it all, she remained remarkably simply were. Catherine did not pretend to be a saint. She wanted to be remembered not as a perfect ruler, but as a great one. And greatness, she knew, demanded compromise. It demanded that you sometimes wear a mask so convincing the world forgets there was ever a face beneath it. Ruling as a woman in the 18th century wasn't simply about breaking rules, it was about rewriting them silently. Behind layers of protocol and silk, Catherine knew this all too well. Her reign was a balancing act between authenticity and illusion, between being human and being immortalized. To the world, she presented strength, clarity, and elegance. But behind the imperial veil, she was constantly calculating, adapting, evolving. She mastered the game of appearances, not to deceive, but to survive. Her portraits showed her as serene and divine, yet formidable. Her writings revealed sharp wit, political insight, and the internal struggles of a sovereign who bore the weight of a continent. Every word she published, every decision she enacted, was another thread in the tapestry she wove of legend, of rule, of legacy. The mask was never meant to hide weakness. It was a shield. For every policy she implemented, there were factions seeking to undermine her. The court was a nest of serpents loyal today, conspiring tomorrow. Catherine moved through it with the grace of a dancer and the cunning of a tactician. Allies were made with flattery, enemies neutralized with charm, or, when necessary, swift force. She was not afraid to act ruthlessly, but never without thought. She understood that mercy, too, could be political. A pardon could bind a rival more effectively than a blade. A gift could plant loyalty deeper than fear. The Empress wielded power like a sculptor wields a chisel delicately, but with purpose. And yet, for all the majesty she commanded, Catherine remained deeply aware of her isolation. The throne, for all its gold and ceremony, was a cold and lonely seat. Trust was rare, and intimacy even rarer. Her lovers came and went, her son kept his distance. Her advisors respected her, but rarely challenged her. She was the most powerful woman in the world and profoundly alone. But solitude did not slow her, it sharpened her. In that quiet, Catherine contemplated eternity not in the heavens, but here, on earth, in the shape of the empire she forged, and the memory she shaped. In her later years, Catherine's body began to tire, but her mind remained as sharp and defiant as ever. Even as her joints stiffened and her steps slowed, the machinery of her empire turned at her command. Ministers came and went. Treaties were drafted and debated. Territories were annexed. She no longer needed to prove her power now. She refined it, sharpened it, used it with the precision of a master who had long since absorbed every lesson the throne could offer. She awoke early, worked late, and rarely indulged in the idleness that defined so many royal courts. Her correspondence with European thinkers continued. Her appetite for information never dulled. Even as gossip circled like vultures whispering about her age, her romances, her succession, she responded not with words, but with achievements. Catherine expanded the Russian Empire into Crimea, the Caucasus, and deep into Eastern Europe. She restructured provincial governance, modernized civil administration, and laid foundations for educational institutions that would last generations. Her vision extended far beyond the borders of her time. She was thinking in centuries, but time, relentless and indifferent, crept closer. The question of succession hung over her like a winter fog. She had long doubted her son Paul, his temperament, his politics, his penchant for resentment. Some say she even drafted a plan to install her grandson Alexander in his place, a boy she believed had the makings of a true sovereign. But death, when it arrived, did so before her final plan could be made law. On November 17, 1796, Catherine suffered a stroke and passed away shortly thereafter. The palace fell silent. The courtiers wept or pretended to, and outside, Russia stood still, not quite ready to believe that the woman who had commanded it for over 3 decades was truly gone. She had come to Russia as a girl no one believed in. She left it as a legend no one could ignore. The moment Catherine drew her final breath, a subtle tremor ran through the empire, not just from the shock of her absence, but from the anticipation of what would come next. For over 3 decades, her will had shaped the direction of Russia with the steadiness of a helmsman steering through storm after storm. Now, the ship was left vulnerable to hands less certain. Her son Paul ascended the throne immediately, stepping into a role he believed had been denied to him too long. But Paul was not Catherine. He lacked her charisma, her political finesse, and above all, her ability to read the hearts of men and nations. What he possessed instead was resentment, years of it, hardened into policy. One of his first acts as emperor was to reverse much of his mother's work. He dismissed her trusted advisors, overturned her reforms, and imposed a rigid military culture upon court life, inspired more by Prussia than Russia. His obsession with control bordered on paranoia. Where Catherine had ruled with strategy and grace, Paul governed with suspicion and rigidity. His reign, unlike hers, would be short-lived. But even as her legacy was challenged in life, it began to grow in death. Across Europe, statesmen and scholars debated the true nature of her rule. Was she an enlightened despot or a cunning autocrat? A reformer or a realist? A philosopher empress or a political opportunist in royal robes? The answer, of course, was yes to all. She had been all of those things, often at once. She defied categorization precisely because she refused to be defined by anyone else's standards. In Russia, her mark was indelible. The cities she developed, the institutions she founded, the borders she expanded, these were not just achievements, but testaments. Statues were raised, portraits multiplied. Her writings continued to be studied and quietly admired, even by those who dared not speak her name with reverence under new regimes. And among the people, the peasants, the students, the distant villagers whose lives she had touched without ever meeting them, Catherine became something rarer still, a symbol, not of perfection, but of possibility, that someone foreign, female, flawed could rise above every limitation and bend history to her will. She had ruled as a woman in a man's world, and made that world hers. With the Empress buried beneath the marble domes of the Saints Peter and Paul Cathedral, Catherine's physical presence left the empire, but her myth only deepened. In salons and courts, in smoky taverns and candlelit libraries, her name was spoken with both reverence and speculation. And like all powerful figures who dared reshape the world, her story began to split in two. One version told of a tyrant in pearls, a woman who loved power more than people, who ruled with velvet gloves hiding iron fists, who softened her image with Enlightenment language, but ruled with an autocrat's heart. Her critics pointed to the suffering of serfs, the unfulfilled promises of reform, and the political enemies crushed beneath her rise. But there was another story, too. This version spoke of the visionary Catherine, the builder of schools, the patron of thinkers, the empress who modernized a frozen land and brought it into conversation with Europe's greatest minds. A woman who fought through layers of prejudice and protocol not to be adored, but to be effective, a sovereign who took seriously the burden of rule, and who believed, deeply, that power could be used to elevate a people even if the climb was slow and treacherous. Both stories were true, and neither was complete. Because Catherine defied simplification, she didn't fit into the roles the world had made for women or for rulers. Her reign wasn't neat. It was messy, glorious, contradictory, and impossibly human. She was a mother and a monarch, a writer and a warrior, a seductress and a stateswoman, and she lived in all those roles without apology. Generations after her death, writers would invent wild stories to explain her greatness, often reducing her to caricature or scandal, as if the real story were too vast, too threatening to patriarchal history to accept as it was. They tried to contain her in anecdotes, rumors, and jokes. But Catherine, as always, proved too large for the frame. Even as Russia marched into the 19th century through war, revolution, reform, and regression, Catherine's name lingered, not just in statues and portraits, but in the way the empire saw itself. Her legacy wasn't just what she built, it was the ambition she injected into the Russian psyche. The idea that even a land bound by ice and hierarchy could be ruled with intellect, boldness, and vision. After Catherine's death, the empire she had forged continued to move forward, but its momentum was hers. The institutions she restructured, the territories she expanded, and the centralized control she refined all carried her fingerprints. Even as her son Paul tried to override her legacy, he could not dismantle its foundation. Catherine had buried her vision so deeply into Russia's bones that it could not be easily exorcised. Foreign diplomats who had once feared or admired her now measured her successors against the scale of her shadow, and almost none measured up. Her successors wore the crown, but none truly ruled like she had. Her long reign had created a unique paradox. She had been a foreign-born woman ruling a fiercely patriarchal, orthodox, and militaristic society, and yet she had governed it better than most of its native sons. Beyond Russia, her name became legend. In Western Europe, intellectuals remembered her as the monarch who bridged the gap between absolute rule and rational reform. In Eastern Europe and the Balkans, her military campaigns were etched into collective memory. Even in lands she never conquered, her influence reached through treaties, ideas, and power plays. But it wasn't just her political legacy that endured. There was also the mythic Catherine, the towering figure who, like Caesar or Napoleon, seemed more concept than mortal. In time, this version of her began to dominate. Stories of her wit, her lovers, her daring coups, her midnight readings of philosophy all were passed down, embroidered by admiration and jealousy alike. Catherine became a kind of mirror, reflecting the fears and fantasies of those who studied her. To feminists, she was a pioneer. To conservatives, a cautionary tale. To historians, an enigma. Her palaces stood like frozen echoes of her ambition. The Hermitage, with its priceless paintings and intellectual splendor. The Winter Palace, with its golden halls and silent chambers. Her correspondence, meticulously preserved, revealed a mind both expansive and disciplined, a sovereign who ruled not just with decree, but with dialogue. And through it all, Russia changed not overnight, and not without resistance, but changed nonetheless. The seeds she planted bore fruit in unpredictable ways. Education, art, bureaucracy, diplomacy all grew from her careful tending. Even the autocracy she reinforced came to be modeled after her example, not as brute force alone, but as performance, intelligence, and persistence. Catherine died as all mortals do, without trumpet or thunder, only silence. Yet the silence she left behind rang louder than most legacies spoken aloud. Because Catherine the Great was not merely an empress, she was a mirror held to power, to ambition, and to the ache of transformation. She had arrived in Russia as a stranger, foreign in name, in tongue, in blood, and yet, when the soil covered her bones, she had become more Russian than the Tsars who came before her. She didn't conquer her empire with swords, but with insight, not with brute dominance, but with elegant defiance. She outlived the men who doubted her, outmaneuvered the plots that sought to cage her, and outshone the myths that tried to reduce her to footnotes or fantasy. Catherine proved something terrifyingly simple, that history bends for those who dare write it in ink, not in echo. Her contradictions were her strength. She believed in Enlightenment ideals and, till revolutionaries began sharpening blades, she freed minds but kept serfs bound. She cultivated beauty even as she centralized control. She ruled as a monarch, but reigned like an author writing the future into present tense. Her reign was an essay in paradox, one written not to be resolved, but to be remembered. And perhaps that is the greatest truth she left behind. That greatness is not perfection, it is persistence. It is rising each morning with a crown too heavy for your head, and wearing it anyway. It is being told you cannot, and answering only with action. Catherine lived in a world that gave women no room to rule, so she redrew the map. She wrote laws with the same hand that underlined Voltaire. She administered empire with the same eyes that saw beauty in sculpture and subtext. She governed not as a guest in a man's world, but as an architect of her own. Today, centuries after her death, her portraits still hang in quiet galleries. Her letters still whisper truths to those who listen closely. Her name still stirs debate, devotion, and defiance. And her story, long stripped of romantic illusions, still reminds us that even amidst the cruelty of power, there is room for vision. And so, Catherine rests not just in her tomb but in time, not as a woman who stole an empire, but as one who remade it in her image. And now, a final question. If power corrupts the soul, what then does greatness demand in return? Is it solitude, sacrifice, or simply memory?